At 5:17 a.m. on the 12th of February, 1945, Corporal Thomas "Tommy" Riley pressed his back against the frozen brick wall of a bombed-out schoolhouse in Bastogne, Belgium. The air smelled of pine and gunpowder, and his breath fogged in front of his face as he adjusted the strap of his M1941 Johnson rifle. At 21, he'd already spent 8 months in the European theatre, fought in the Battle of the Bulge, watched 3 of his squad mates die, and earned a Bronze Star for dragging a wounded comrade to safety under fire. But today, he faced a different kind of enemy, German machine gunners, dug into the forest 600 yards away, picking off American infantrymen as they tried to advance through the snow. Riley was part of a small scout team attached to the 101st Airborne Division, tasked with locating enemy machine gun nests so artillery could destroy them. The problem wasn't his rifle, accurate to 700 yards, with a lightweight design that made it easy to carry through thick woods. It wasn't his training either. He'd grown up hunting deer in the hills of West Virginia, learning to track movement and stay hidden long before he enlisted. The problem was the snow. Every time he shifted position, his boots crunched in the powder, echoing through the quiet forest. Every time he lifted his head to scan for targets, the white of his helmet reflected the faint morning light, giving away his position. German gunners had already wounded 2 of his team that week. Both hit while trying to spot nests, both caught because the snow turned them into glowing targets. The 101st had been pinned down outside Bastogne for 3 days. The Germans had fortified the surrounding forests with over a dozen machine gun nests, each dug into a foxhole or hidden behind a fallen tree. The nests were spaced 200 yards apart, covering each other's fields of fire, so if one was targeted, the others could open fire on the Americans. Infantry assaults had failed twice. With heavy casualties, artillery barrages were useless because nobody could pinpoint the nests' exact locations. Riley's team was the last hope. Their job was to sneak to the edge of the forest, mark the nests with smoke grenades, and get out before the Germans zeroed in on them. His first scout that morning was Private Jimmy Lopez, a 19-year-old from Los Angeles who'd joined the army to escape a life of gang violence. Lopez was quick, quiet, and had a knack for moving through cover without making a sound. They'd paired up at dawn, crawling on their bellies through the snow toward the forest edge. Riley watched Lopez from 50 yards back, covering his 6. At 5:32 a.m., Lopez froze, then raised his hand, signaling he'd found a nest. He started to reach for his smoke grenade, when a burst of machine gun fire cut through the air. Lopez fell forward, his body sinking into the snow. Blood seeped through his uniform, turning the white around him pink. Riley couldn't move, could only stare as the Germans fired 2 more bursts, ensuring Lopez was dead. He waited 10 minutes before crawling to Lopez's body, his hands shaking so hard he could barely grip his rifle. He checked for a pulse. Nothing. The bullet had hit Lopez in the chest, right above his armor plate. Riley noticed it then, the white of Lopez's helmet, still glinting in the light, even as his body lay motionless. The Germans had seen that glint. They'd tracked it, waited for Lopez to make a move, and fired. That's how they'd killed the others, too. The snow wasn't just cover. It was a trap. Every light-colored uniform, every helmet, every piece of equipment reflected the sun, turning American soldiers into easy targets. By mid-morning, Riley was back at the 101st's command post, staring at a map of the forest and trying not to think about Lopez's body. Captain Markham, his handed him a cup of hot coffee black, just how he liked it, and sighed. "We need those nests marked, Riley. Infantry's ready to move, but they can't without artillery support." Riley nodded, taking a sip of coffee that burned his tongue. He thought about Lopez, about the glint of his helmet, about how the snow turned every American into a target. The Germans were wearing dark gray uniforms, blending into the trees and the shadowy forest floor. They didn't reflect light, they disappeared. That's when it hit him. The problem wasn't the snow, it was the color of their gear. American uniforms were olive drab, but their helmets, gloves, and backpacks were a light tan that stood out against white snow. Their rifles had polished metal parts that glinted in the sun. The Germans had adapted. They'd even started covering their helmets with pine branches to break up their outline. The Americans, they were still using summer gear, not built for winter combat. Riley thought about the things he carried. A canteen, a first aid kit, a pack of cigarettes, and a roll of burlap he'd found in a destroyed French barn a week earlier. He'd used it to wrap his rifle at night, to keep the metal from freezing to his hands. But what if he used it for something else? What if he covered his helmet, his rifle, his gear, anything that reflected light or stood out against the snow? It was a long shot. Burlap was rough, hard to cut, and would probably slow him down. But Lopez was dead. 2 other scouts were wounded. Riley didn't have a better idea. He pulled the burlap out of his pack. It was brown, frayed at the edges, about 3 feet long and 2 feet wide. He held it up to his helmet, wrapping it around the crown. It fit, but it slipped. He needed to secure it. From his pocket, he pulled a length of parachute cord he'd salvaged from a downed C-47, thin, strong, and easy to tie. He cut the burlap into strips with his pocket knife, then tied them around his helmet, overlapping the edges to cover the tan paint completely. Next, he wrapped a strip around his rifle's barrel and stock, covering the polished metal parts. He even tied a small piece over his backpack's shoulder straps, which had a light-colored buckle that glinted. When he was done, he stepped outside and stood in the snow. Private Miller, a medic, looked up and laughed. "What were you supposed to be, Riley? A walking bush?" Riley didn't laugh. He walked 20 yards away, turned, and asked Miller if he could see him. Miller squinted, then shook his head. "You blend right in with the trees. I wouldn't spot you if I wasn't looking for you." Riley smiled. For the first time since Lopez died. It worked. By 11 a.m., Riley was back at the forest edge, this time with Private Miguel Miggs Santiago, a 24-year-old from Puerto Rico who'd served as a sniper in the Pacific before being transferred to Europe. Santiago had seen his share of jungle camouflage, but he'd never tried anything with burlap. When he saw Riley's helmet and rifle, he raised an eyebrow. "That's different. You sure it won't get caught on branches?" Riley shrugged, adjusting the burlap strip around his wrist. He'd added it to cover his watch, which had a reflective face. "Better caught on branches than shot because my helmet glints." Lopez didn't get a chance to worry about branches. Santiago nodded, his expression softening. He'd known Lopez, too, had shared a foxhole with him during the bulge. "Fair enough. You got extra burlap? I'll give it a shot." Riley had brought 2 more rolls, salvaged from the same barn, stuffed in his pack. He cut a length for Santiago, showing him how to wrap it around his M1 Garand's barrel, overlapping the strips to avoid gaps. Santiago tied a piece around his helmet, then another around his boots. "My laces are white," he explained. "Caught my eye this morning when I tied 'em." They worked in silence for 10 minutes. The only sound the crunch of snow under their knees and the distant crack of a German rifle. When they finished, they knelt side by side, scanning the forest. Riley's heart didn't race like it had with Lopez. The burlap didn't make him invisible, but it made him feel less like a target. They moved slow, crawling on their bellies, their rifles pressed to the snow. Riley's burlap scraped against pine needles. But it didn't snag, not like he'd feared. Every few yards they paused, listening for the rattle of a German machine gun or the murmur of voices. At 11:45 a.m., Santiago froze, tapping Riley's shoulder. He pointed to a cluster of pine trees 300 yards away. Something moved behind them, a flash of dark gray. Riley raised his binoculars, focusing in. There it was. A machine gun nest, dug into a hollow under a fallen oak. A German gunner sat behind the weapon, his helmet barely visible above the snowbank. Next to him, another soldier passed a canteen. Riley signaled to Santiago, "Stay here. Cover me," then inched forward, his hand hovering over the smoke grenade at his belt. The burlap on his helmet brushed against a low branch, and he held his breath. The German gunner didn't look up. Riley crept closer. 250 yards. 200. 150. He could hear the Germans talking now, their voices low, guttural. One laughed, and Riley tensed. Had they seen him? He checked his helmet, making sure the burlap hadn't slipped. It held. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the smoke grenade, and pulled the pin. He counted to 3, then lobbed it toward the nest. It landed 10 yards from the oak, and thick red smoke began to billow upward. The Germans yelled, scrambling to move the machine gun. Riley didn't wait. He turned, crawling back toward Santiago, his boots kicking up snow. A burst of machine gun fire zipped over his head. But it was off. Target too high. The Germans hadn't seen him. They'd only seen the smoke. When he reached Santiago, they were already moving, backtracking to the American lines. "You see that?" Santiago whispered, grinning. "He didn't even look your way." The burlap worked. Riley nodded, his chest tight relief, not fear. They'd marked the first nest. By 1 p.m. They were back at command post, covered in snow, their burlap crusted with ice. Captain Markham was waiting, a radio in his hand. "Artillery hit the nest 10 minutes ago," he said, handing Riley a cup of hot cocoa. "Wiped it out. Good work, but we need 3 more. Intel says they're spread out along the western edge." Riley took a sip of cocoa, the warmth spreading through his chest. "We can find 'em, but we need more burlap. Miggs and I used most of what I had." Markham frowned. "Burlap? Where are we going to get burlap in the middle of Bastogne?" Riley thought for a second, then remembered the supply truck that had gotten stuck on the road to town 2 days earlier. It had been carrying sacks of potatoes, all wrapped in burlap. The supply truck on Route 12, the one with the flat tire, it had potato sacks burlap. We could grab 'em. Markham hesitated. Route 12 was under sporadic German fire. Sending a team there was risky, but the alternative was sending more scouts out without camouflage, more Lopez's. He nodded. "Take Santiago and 2 others. Be quick, and Riley." Riley looked up. "Don't get shot. We need you." An hour later, Riley, Santiago, Private Miller, the medic, and Corporal Lee, who'd driven a jeep in North Africa, were bouncing down Route 12.5 track. Lee kept the vehicle slow, his eyes on the tree line. "Heard Germans were sniping here yesterday," he said, gripping the steering wheel. Took out a supply driver. Riley sat in the back, his rifle propped against the door, scanning the road ahead. The burlap on his helmet flapped in the wind, but he didn't fix it. Let it move, let it look like part of the landscape. They found the truck at 2:30 p.m., tilted to one side, its rear tires flat, potato sacks spilling out of the back. Miller and Lee stayed with the half-track, covering the road, while Riley and Santiago ran to the truck. The sacks were heavy, stuffed with potatoes that had frozen solid, but the burlap was thick, perfect. They tossed sack after sack into the half-track, their hands numb from the cold. "How many we got?" Santiago yelled, heaving another sack over the side. "Enough for the whole scout team," Riley said, grinning. "Maybe even the infantry if they want it." Just as they grabbed the last sack, a shot rang out. Riley hit the ground, pulling Santiago down with him. The bullet struck the truck's door, leaving a dent. "Sniper!" Lee yelled from the half. "Track!" Riley crawled to the truck's rear, peering around the corner. He saw movement 400 yards away, a flash of metal, probably a scope. He raised his rifle, but the sniper was gone. "We gotta move," Santiago said, pulling Riley to his feet. They ran back to the half track, tossing the last sack in, and Lee hit the gas. The vehicle lurched forward, snow spraying from its tires. Riley looked back. No more shots. The burlap had hidden them again. When they returned to command post, the scout team swarmed them. 4 other scouts, all who'd lost partners or narrowly escaped being shot, wanted burlap. Riley and Santiago set up a makeshift workshop in the corner of a bombed out barn, cutting sacks into strips, showing everyone how to wrap their helmets, rifles, even their canteens. Private Torres, who'd had a bullet graze his shoulder the day before, wrapped burlap around his backpack's strap buckle. "This thing's been shining like a beacon," he said, tapping the buckle. "Won't any more." By dusk, every scout in the team had burlap camouflage. Riley stood back, watching them test it, stepping into the snow, turning, asking if they could be seen. He thought of Lopez, of how different things might have been if Lopez had had burlap. He didn't dwell on it, though. There was work to do that night. Markham called him into his tent. "The infantry heard about your burlap," he said, sliding a map across the table. "He wants his lead platoon to use it. They're going to assault the forest tomorrow at dawn." "You got enough to cover 'em," Riley thought. They had 6 full sacks left, plus the strips they'd cut. Enough for 20 men, maybe 25. "We can cut more tonight." Markham nodded, clapping Riley on the shoulder. "Good. You're not just a scout anymore, Riley. You're a teacher." Riley stayed up until midnight, cutting burlap with Santiago and Miller. The barn was cold, but they had a small fire going, and Miller had brought a bottle of brandy stolen from a German supply cache that they passed around. "You ever think this would be your job?" Santiago said, holding up a burlap strip, wrapping helmets instead of shooting Germans. Riley laughed, his fingers stiff from cutting. "Nah, thought I'd be hunting deer back home by now. But this matters more than deer." Santiago nodded, staring at the fire. "Yeah, it does." At 4:30 a.m. the next morning, Riley stood with 25 infantrymen, helping them wrap burlap around their M1s and helmets. One private, a kid from Iowa named Jake, frowned as he tied his strip. "This feels silly, like I'm playing dress up." Riley stopped him, placing a hand on his arm. Lopez thought it might be silly too. "He's dead because his helmet glinted. You want to be silly, or you want to go home?" The kid's face paled. He nodded, tightening the burlap around his helmet. "Silly's good. Silly's better." By 5 a.m., the infantry platoon was ready, lined up at the forest edge, their burlap, covered gear blending into the grey dawn. Riley stood with Markham and the platoon leader, Lieutenant Carter. "Artillery will hit first," Carter said, checking his watch. "Then we move, Riley. You and Santiago lead. You know the nests." Riley nodded, gripping his rifle. The burlap on his barrel was stiff with frost, but it felt like an old friend now. At 5:15 a.m., the artillery started. The ground shook, and the sky lit up with orange flashes as shells exploded in the forest. Riley closed his eyes, counting. 10, 15, 20. When the last shell hit, he yelled, "Let's go!" and sprinted into the snow, Santiago right beside him. The forest exploded with noise as the infantry platoon followed, boots crunching snow, rifles clicking into place, men yelling to stay in formation. But Riley's focus narrowed to the trees ahead. He'd marked 3 more nests the day before, memorizing their positions. One behind a rotting log 400 yards in, another in a shallow foxhole under a stand of birches, and a third hidden in the branches of a fallen pine. The burlap on his arms brushed against pine needles, leaving small clumps of snow on the fabric. But he barely noticed. All he could hear was his own breath, loud in his ears, and the distant pop of a German rifle. Santiago tapped his shoulder at 5:22 a.m., pointing to the rotting log. Riley nodded. There it was, the top of a German helmet peeking over the wood. The gunner hadn't noticed them yet. He was staring toward the American lines, probably waiting for the artillery to stop. Riley signaled to the infantryman behind him to hold, then inched forward, his rifle raised. The burlap on his helmet kept slipping. He'd tied it too loose in the rush, and he adjusted it with one hand, his eyes never leaving the log. 10 yards away, he froze. The German moved, reaching for a canteen, and Riley held his breath. The man's uniform was dark gray, blending into the log, but his gloves were light brown, no camouflage. Riley smiled to himself. We're not the only ones who forgot winter. He squeezed the trigger. The Johnson rifle's report was muffled by the snow, and the German fell backward, his canteen spilling into the snow. No other movement, no backup, no cries for help. The first nest was neutralized. Santiago moved up beside him, his Garand ready. Clean shot, he whispered. Riley nodded, already moving toward the birch stand. The infantry platoon followed, spreading out to cover the flanks. Lieutenant Carter jogged up, his burlap-covered helmet askew. You two know what you're doing. Keep going. We'll secure this nest. The second nest was trickier. The foxhole was dug deep, with a pile of snow stacked in front for cover. Riley could see the barrel of a machine gun poking out, its metal glinting in the dawn light. They didn't cover their weapon, he thought. He and Santiago crawled to a patch of thick underbrush, lying flat in the snow. The burlap on their backs melted a small circle of slush, but it kept them hidden. When a German soldier peeked over the foxhole's edge, he looked right past them, his eyes scanning the open field beyond. He's alone, Santiago whispered. I can take him. Riley shook his head. Machine gunners usually had a loader. He pointed to the left, where a gap in the birches led to the foxhole's rear. I'll go around. You keep him distracted. Santiago nodded, raising his rifle and firing a shot into the air. The German ducked, yelling something in German, and Riley sprinted toward the gap, his boots slipping on icy snow. He reached the foxhole's rear in 10 seconds, his rifle pressed to his shoulder. The loader was there, fumbling with a belt of ammunition, his back to Riley. Riley grabbed him by the collar, yanking him backward into the snow, and pressed the barrel of his rifle to his temple. "Gib off!" he yelled. "Surrender!" The only German word he'd learned. The loader froze, his hands raised. Riley motioned for him to stand, then pushed him toward Santiago. The gunner, hearing the commotion, turned, and Santiago fired. The shot hit him in the chest, and he fell into the foxhole, the machine gun clattering to the snow. Riley breathed out. 2 nests down, 1 to go. By 6 a.m., the sun was higher, casting long shadows through the trees. The snow was starting to melt, dripping from the pine branches onto Riley's burlap, but he didn't care. The third nest, the one in the fallen pine, was the biggest threat. Intelligence said it had 2 machine guns, covering the main path to Bastogne. He and Santiago moved ahead of the platoon, their rifles ready, their ears tuned for the rattle of gunfire. They found it at 6:15 a.m., hidden in the crook of a pine tree that had fallen during a storm. The trunk was thick, blocking most of the view, but Riley could see the tips of 2 machine gun barrels sticking out, pointing toward the road. There were 3 Germans, 2 gunners, 1 loader, sitting on the snow, passing a pack of cigarettes. Riley counted the distance, 250 yards, too far for a clean shot with the Johnson, not with the wind picking up. We need to get closer, he whispered to Santiago. Santiago nodded, but his eyes were on the platoon behind them. They were 100 yards back, waiting. If we take too long, They'll move in. The gunners will cut 'em down. Riley bit his lip. Santiago was right. The platoon didn't have burlap on their boots. Their laces were white. Their canteen caps were metal. If they moved forward, the Germans would see them. Then he had an idea. He pulled a handful of snow from the ground, packing it into a ball, and tossed it toward the pine tree. It hit the trunk with a soft thud. The Germans looked up, their hands going to their rifles. Riley tossed another, this time to the left of the tree. The loader stood, walking toward the sound. His rifle raised. Riley signaled to Santiago, "Now," and they both fired. Santiago's shot hit the first gunner in the shoulder, sending him sprawling. Riley's hit the loader in the back, dropping him to his knees. The second gunner grabbed the machine gun, swinging it toward Riley. But the infantry platoon opened fire, a hail of bullets hitting the pine trunk. The gunner froze, then threw his hands up. It was over. By 6:30 a.m., all 3 nests were secured. The platoon gathered in the snow, cheering, slapping each other on the back. Lieutenant Carter walked up to Riley, shaking his hand. "You did it. We're through to Bastogne. The Co's gonna want to meet you." Riley shrugged, looking at Santiago. "We did it. Not just me." Santiago grinned, clapping him on the back. "Yeah, but you had the idea with the burlap. Don't be modest." Word spread fast. By noon, every unit in the 101st Airborne was asking for burlap. Riley and Santiago spent the afternoon cutting sacks, showing soldiers how to wrap their gear, while Captain Markham radioed for more supplies. "Tell him we need burlap. Lots of it. It's saving lives." The response came back an hour later. A supply truck would arrive that evening with 50 rolls, salvaged from French farms and German warehouses. That night, Riley sat in the barn with the scout team, drinking hot coffee and eating rations. Private Torres pulled out a pack of cigarettes, offering one to Riley. "Heard you're gonna get a medal," he said. Riley shook his head, taking the cigarette. "Nah, just did what I had to do. Lopez would have done the same." Torres nodded, staring at his burlap-covered rifle. "Yeah, but he didn't get the chance. This," he tapped the burlap, "is for him, for all of 'em." The supply truck arrived at 8 p.m. Its back loaded with burlap rolls, each labeled, "For winter camouflage, Priority 1." The driver, a sergeant from Iowa, handed Riley a note. "From the Co, keep up the good work. The boys need you." Riley folded the note, putting it in his pocket. He didn't need a medal. This was enough. By the 15th of February, 3 days after the forest assault, burlap camouflage had spread beyond the 101st Airborne. A patrol from the 82nd Airborne, passing through Bastogne, saw Riley's team and asked for strips. By nightfall, they'd taken 5 sacks back to their camp. A tank crew even wrapped burlap around their Sherman's gun barrel. "The metal glints in the sun," the gunner explained. "Germans spot us before we spot them." Riley didn't mind the attention. He just kept cutting, kept teaching. His hands raw from the burlap's rough texture and the cold. On the 17th of February, Major General Taylor, commander of the 101st, visited the scout team's barn. He stood in the doorway, watching Riley show a private how to tie burlap around his helmet, and cleared his throat. The room went quiet. Riley stood, saluting, "Sir." Taylor waved off the salute, stepping closer to examine Riley's rifle. He ran a finger along the burlap strip, then looked at Riley. "This is your idea?" Riley nodded. "Just trying to keep the guys alive, sir. Lopez, my scout. He got shot, 'cause his helmet glinted. I didn't want that to happen again." Taylor was quiet for a minute, then smiled. "Ingenuity's the best weapon we got, Corporal. Better than any rifle or tank. You've saved more lives with burlap than some soldiers do with a machine gun." He turned to Captain Markham. Get this documented. I want every unit in the division using this by the end of the week. And Riley. Riley looked up. I'm putting you in for a Silver Star. You've earned it. Riley didn't know what to say. He'd never wanted medals. Never thought he deserved them. But when Taylor left, Santiago clapped him on the back, yelling, Silver Star. You're gonna be a war hero. Riley laughed, shaking his head. Nah, just a guy who found a use for old potato sacks. But later, when he was alone, he pulled the note from the supply driver out of his pocket and read it again. For a second, he thought of Lopez, wondered what his friend would say. He likes to think Lopez would have joked about it, said something like, took you long enough to get recognized. The Silver Star ceremony was held on the 20th of February, in a field outside Bastogne. Snow fell lightly, sticking to the soldiers' burlap-covered helmets. General Taylor pinned the medal to Riley's uniform, and the scout team cheered so loud that birds flew from the nearby trees. Santiago took a photograph, Riley standing tall, the medal glinting on his chest, his rifle propped beside him, burlap still wrapped around the barrel. Riley sent the photo home to his mom in West Virginia with a note. This is for the guys who didn't make it. Love you. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, V-Day. Riley was in Germany then, part of the occupation force, still teaching soldiers how to use burlap, now paired with netting for spring foliage. He stood in a square in Berlin that day, watching people celebrate, and thought of Bastogne, of Lopez, of Santiago, of the infantrymen who'd walked through the forest with burlap on their gear. He pulled a small strip of burlap from his pocket. He'd kept it, frayed and stained with snow and blood, and twisted it between his fingers. It wasn't much, just a piece of cloth, but it had meant everything. Santiago went home to Puerto Rico that summer, becoming a police officer in San Juan. He and Riley wrote letters for years, Santiago telling stories of his kids, Riley talking about his job at a lumber mill back in West Virginia. They never forgot Bastogne. Every the 12th of February, the anniversary of Lopez's death, they'd call each other. Remember the burlap, Santiago would say. Riley would laugh. How could I forget? My hands still hurt thinking about it. Riley left the army in 1946, returning to West Virginia. He married his high school sweetheart Mary in 1947, and they had 2 kids, Tommy Jr., named after him, and Lisa. He never talked much about the war, not even to his family. When Tommy Jr. was 10, he found the Silver Star in a box in the attic, along with the photograph from the ceremony. Dad, why didn't you tell me about this? He asked. Riley sat him down, pulled out the burlap strip, and told him about Lopez, about the snow, about the machine gun nests. It wasn't about the medal, he said. It was about making sure other dads came home, just like I did. Years passed. Riley's kids grew up, had kids of their own. He retired from the lumber mill in 1982, spending his days hunting. He still wrapped burlap around his rifle during deer season, and gardening. In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of VE Day, Santiago visited him in West Virginia. They sat on Riley's porch, drinking iced tea, and talked about Bastogne until the sun went down. You know, Santiago said, I saw a documentary last year about the Bulge. They talked about winter camouflage, but they never mentioned burlap, never mentioned you. Riley shrugged. Doesn't matter. We know. The guys who were there, we know. Santiago died in 2001. Riley went to Puerto Rico for the funeral, wearing his old army jacket, the Silver Star pinned to the lapel. He stood in front of Santiago's casket, holding the burlap strip he'd kept for 56 years, and whispered, Thanks for having my back. We did good. Tommy Riley died on the 12th of February 2008. exactly 63 years after Lopez's death. He was 84. His obituary mentioned his service in World War II, his Silver Star, and his work as a lumber mill worker. It didn't mention the burlap. But at his funeral, 3 men showed up. Veterans from the 101st, all in their 80s, all wearing burlap strips pinned to their jackets. They told Riley's grandchildren stories about the forest assault, about the burlap that kept them hidden, about the corporal who'd turned potato sacks into a lifeline. Today, if you visit the 101st Airborne Division Museum in Fort Campbell, Kentucky, you'll find a display case dedicated to winter combat in Bastogne. Inside, there's an M1941 Johnson rifle, its barrel wrapped in frayed burlap, and a tan helmet covered in the same rough cloth. The plaque reads, "Burlap Camouflage, Field Innovation, 1945. Used by 101st Airborne Scouts to neutralize German machine gun nests, saved countless lives." There's no name, no mention of Corporal Thomas Riley, but that's okay. The burlap tells the story. It tells the story of a kid from West Virginia who didn't want to see his friends die, of a simple idea that spread like wildfire, born not from a general's order or a training manual, but from necessity, of how war isn't just won by weapons. It's won by soldiers who notice the small things: a glinting helmet, a piece of burlap, a way to keep the next guy alive. That's the real legacy of Tommy Riley. Not a medal, not a name in a museum, but the men who came home because he took a potato sack and turned it into hope. The men who got to hug their moms, marry their sweethearts, watch their kids grow up, all because of a corporal with raw hands and a good idea. And if you listen closely, when the wind blows through the pine trees outside Bastogne, you can almost hear it: the crunch of snow under boots, the soft rustle of burlap against branches, and a quiet voice saying, "Keep your head down, stay hidden, we're gonna get home." That's the sound of a hero, even if nobody remembers his name.